Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. My name is Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, and I'm your host on the Tenpenny Files. This isn't just another interview show. I hold daily discussions with guests who research reveals evidence and challenges official narratives and the commonly seen headlines. Topics span from global policy, national government, history, astronomy, food, health, and fitness, as well as authors who take deep dives into the biblical scripture and, of course, we talk about vaccines. For listeners ready to get their questions answered to stories they've been told, the Tenpenny Files is the show for you. Join me here every day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say, but had often been censored, silenced, or ignored. Before I introduce you to today's special guest, I want to encourage everyone here to become a Tenpenny Prime member in 2026. You will benefit from a monthly article, recorded presentation, and the Ask the Expert masterclass we hold each month. Go to primemembership.drtenpenny.com, click on the membership tab to learn more, and hopefully that you will join us. Now let's jump right into today's conversation with my guest, pulmonary and critical care physician, Dr. Pierre Kory, to talk about one of his two new, very important books, The War on Chlorine Dioxide, the shocking history of a simple molecule that kills pathogens, neutralizes toxins, and restores health at a cellular level, yet has been relentlessly smeared, censored, and suppressed. Dr. Kory, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files. Thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule to join me here today.
Oh, Sherri, it's a pleasure. For you, anytime. Good to be here.
Well, thank you so much. So let's start from the beginning. What is chlorine dioxide and how does it work biologically against pathogens, biofilms, and toxins?
Yeah. So chlorine dioxide is, I guess I'll start right at the top. I'll probably say it 20 times in this interview, but it is not bleach, right? It has the word chlorine in it, so everyone also automatically thinks that it's bleach, but it's not. That bleach is called sodium hypochlorite. And chlorine dioxide, it's an oxidizing agent. And what does that mean? It sits in the category of other oxidizing therapies, right? So people have heard of ozone therapy, ultraviolet blood irradiation, hydrogen peroxide, chlorine dioxide. And what does it mean to oxidize? An oxidizing agent is something that can steal an electron from a nearby compound. And when an oxidizing agent steals that electron, basically you just need to think of it as it unravels the membrane. So particularly pathogens, when chlorine dioxide encounters a pathogen, right, which is an invading microbe, whether it's a virus, a fungus, or bacteria, it'll oxidize that pathogen and just unravel the membrane and essentially destroy it. It is the widest biocide that we know in terms of its breadth, in terms of the amount of pathogens that it can kill. And I'll also just finish by saying what's fascinating about chlorine dioxide, and this is where it's such an amazing compound, is that it's actually a weak oxidizing agent. And why is that important? Is because when you put it in the body, it actually, we don't have any evidence. Well, there's not a lot of evidence on it in use because it's suppressed, but there's no evidence to show that it would disrupt your microbiome. Your microbiome has a lot of antioxidant defenses. And so it can live amongst your biome without killing it, but pathogens don't have those antioxidant defenses. So it's really selective and safe.
You know, talking about safe, a lot of times throughout your book, you talk about the dose matters. Why does
Mhm.
the dose matter so much?
Oh, that goes back to what is it, Paracelsus in Middle Ages, right? So, uh, well, basically, water, right? That's the best example. Water is poison if you take too much of it, right? We know that people who drink excessive amounts of water, you can get really ill. In fact, you can die. People have died from taking too much water. Everything has a dose. Caffeine has a lethal dose, right? Every medicine out there, even natural substances, avocado probably has a lethal dose, right? And so to call something a poison without taking into account the dose is misrepresenting the dangers, right? And that is probably, Sherri, you're keying in on that's their number one tool to try to get people to not use chlorine dioxide. They call it a poison, a toxin, and a bleach over and over and over. And where that becomes clownish is that chlorine dioxide is used around the world in our drinking water. It's used to purify water. In Europe, it's a very common water treatment method. A little bit less so in the US. We only have about 10 to 15% of water treatment centers that use it, but it's very common. Campers, when they're out in the wilderness, what do they take with them? They take chlorine dioxide tablets, right? For emergency drinking water, like from a stream, you pop a couple of tablets in your canteen and make sure it purifies, it kills all the microbes. And so it's literally regulated at a certain dose to be drank. Every one of us ingests it when we drink our water. But they want to pretend that anyone who ingests it at any dose, it's a toxin. And what we know from the EPA itself, when you look at the toxicity studies, the doses that are used around the world when people use it to treat disease, they fall well under any toxic limits. And so I'm just trying to poke holes in all the propaganda the media is going to say. I mean, there's not a media article that I've ever seen that mentions chlorine dioxide that doesn't contain the word bleach in it, or poison, or toxin. And it's just not true.
And when you start out your book or the first portion of your book, you take the history, you go all the way back into the late 1800s when it was first identified, and how many from the early 1900s all the way up to about 2010, all the different ways that it was used to sterilize, plants and water and our food and all that stuff. And then suddenly it became, just villainized and
Yep.
really talked against it. Where was the turning point of where it was so used pervasively across all these industries to suddenly it's a bleach and it's a villain and it's dangerous and poisonous?
Yeah. Well, it's always been safe to use in industry, right? So food, beverage industry, cleaning equipment, medical equipment. But again, it's safe to even use on food. That's all fine and good. They have no problems with that. They'll never call it well, they could call it a bleach there because it's being used to clean. The danger, not the danger, but the threat becomes, right? When I say threat, we're talking about financial threats. The pharmaceutical industry protects itself in what we know is demonstrably and repeatedly criminal ways. I have said that I believe that chlorine dioxide is the single most suppressed therapy in the world today and has been for many decades. And why is that? So why do they call it bleach and a poison? The one thing that they don't want you to do is to use it in oral ingestion at therapeutic doses. And the reason why that is because it has mechanisms that make it broadly applicable to any number of diseases. It certainly is the answer to actually all infectious diseases. There's only a couple of organisms that potentially have some resistance and probably would just need higher doses. But other than that, you have the complete breadth of pathogens that it could treat. And this is actually a really big public health issue. When you look at the data into multi-drug resistant bacteria that is skyrocketing around the world, right? Because the horse doses of antibiotics that are being used everywhere. And so this really could be a panacea for a lot of problems, but it's a huge threat, right? And what is the threat to the pharmaceutical industry? They do not like inexpensive, safe, widely available therapies. And the most dangerous part, I think, or not, I don't want to say dangerous, most threatening part of chlorine dioxide is not that it has broad applicability, but you can buy it on Amazon for $20 without a doctor as the gatekeeper, right? Whereas even with ivermectin, when ivermectin threatened their profit potential in COVID, man, they pulled out all the stops on ivermectin. But they had a lever there, right? They could harass doctors, take their licenses. They got the pharmacists to stop filling. I mean, they pulled out every stop in that war on ivermectin. But with chlorine dioxide, it's an underground thing. I mean, there's millions of people around the world who know chlorine dioxide. It's much better known, I would say, in Central and South America, the Caribbean, well known in Africa. A lot of missionaries there have treated many people for lots of different infectious diseases. But I did hear a rather disturbing rumor, and I can't remember the country, but I was told that in one of the African countries, like you can't get chlorine dioxide anymore. They will not allow even the precursor, which is called sodium chlorite. They will interdict it at customs. And so we are at war. You know that, right? We're at war against the pharmaceutical industry in terms of health. So,
For
yeah.
sure. You know, you've mentioned a couple of times about oxidative therapies and how this is just another oxidative therapy. Talk about how chlorine dioxide has been dismissed alongside of things like ozone and UVB light and IV hydrogen peroxide, DMSO, all of those things that are simple, inexpensive, non-toxic. How did all of these things become so villainized?
Yeah, it's because I think they're so widely effective, and they're probably better than whatever the patented pricey pharmaceutical is in its place to try to treat the disease. And it's the broadness, right? It's that, with ozone, there's so many different with all these oxidative therapies. It's not just antimicrobial, biocidal, but they do have anti-inflammatory mechanisms. So you find it for any number of even autoimmune inflammatory diseases. And so when you have something that's like a jack of all trades, that they don't like that. They want one pill for every problem, and they control those pipelines, right? And if you have something that can span across all their funnel pipelines of income, that's really threatening. And I want to say one particular thing, right? So when we list the oxidative therapies, what makes chlorine dioxide the most suppressed and the most attacked is oral ingestion, right?
Hmm.
UVBI is very hard. You can't scale that, right? There's too few practitioners. You need a clinic. You need an IV. Same thing with ozone, right? You need either machine to insufflate, either rectal insufflation or IV. Hydrogen peroxide can be done orally, but that's a lot trickier. That doesn't have the same safety margin around chlorine dioxide. So I don't think that's for the masses, but that's why chlorine dioxide stands out above them all, because you can buy it on Amazon, mix it in your kitchen. There's plenty of protocols all over the place teaching you how to use it. It's not the easiest thing to use, though. I should be careful with that. It's the reason why is it's very dose dependent in terms of side effects. And I got to be clear on something, because I even had to learn this at my stage of my career. I learned this a few years ago, but I finally learned the difference between an adverse effect and a side effect. And there's actually a definition. So a side effect is the typical thing that happens when you take a medicine that doesn't agree with you. It's a transient symptom, right? So it's nausea, vomiting, headache, fatigue, whatever. An adverse effect is actually a pathologic damage, right? So it's where, like, you get tissue injury, or, an inflamed tissue, or a nerve gets damaged. And those are adverse effects. And the therapeutic dosing of chlorine dioxide is well under the adverse effect level. So you're not going to get injured from chlorine dioxide at the doses that are generally used, but it does come with side effects. And the side effects come out at different doses for different people. Everyone has different sensitivities. And what are the typical side effects? Number one is watery stool. So you're going to start to have a little bit of diarrhea. Next, maybe a little GI upset, nausea, or vomiting, but it can all be controlled around dosing. So all the protocols kind of guide you on titration. You start with, like, 1 drop an hour or a little less than that, and you go up as tolerated. And so there is some finesse around it, and it's not the easiest therapy. Although I hold it out as being particularly threatening because it's oral and cheap and safe, using it, it's an interesting therapy, right? Because the how you use it, you take a dose every 45 minutes to an hour. It's very short acting. And so you have to the general way to do it is you prepare a bottle, like a water bottle, and people, set their watch, and they have to take their dose, every 45 minutes to an hour, which is unlike most other therapies, right? You take your pill once or twice a day, and you're good to go.
You know, you mentioned something in your book, The War on Chlorine Dioxide. Treatments ones that were once mainstream are now ignored. And you specifically talk about Cox blast therapies, COCH blast therapies. What are those?
Yeah. So that's from 100 years ago. So there's a guy named William F. Koch, his story is truly incredible, both shocking and, I guess, unsurprising to me at this point. But he was one of the youngest and brightest physiologist medical doctors in the country. He was trained, I think, in like 3 different specialties, got his medical degree. I think he had a PhD. he published an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine when he was like in his mid 20s, truly, high flying in the world of science and physiology. He kind of he was one of the pioneers in understanding the parathyroid gland, and that was most of his research. So here's a guy, like one of the most celebrated young physicians in the country, so bright that he developed this therapy called glyoxylide. Incredibly complex chemistry. No one's really ever gotten the true formula because of what happened to him. He made sure that he didn't release it, but he started using it, and it we don't really know all of its mechanisms, but it clearly had oxidative mechanisms. And boy, was he doing a really good job against cancer. And
Oh,
if you want to ruin your career, come up with a new way to treat cancer,
no
right,
kidding.
Sherry? And so that's
Absolutely.
the biggest bear in the room, right? I mean, so many doctors, their livelihoods depend on treating cancer. And he came along with this glyoxylide therapy, and it was tricky. It was injectable, but it was catalytic. Like he had cures with one injection, because it triggered these process. It's very complex. I tried to study it, but that's 100 years ago, right? So in the late 1910s, early 1920s, he starts treating people and the stories start to circulate. Newspapers start writing articles. And that's when his career went sideways. And, where did the gauntlet come on him and where did it came from? Our friends at the AMA, right? Way back then, the American Medical Association, they purportedly tried to set him up in a study in Detroit, but they did everything to interfere with him. Wouldn't let him get the data. He couldn't follow up on the patients. Then they took away the funding, and the rest of his life is a really sad story. Like he basically had to leave the country to continue his research. He was brought into court by the FDA, the FTC. They brought him back from Brazil where he'd gone, and then they brought him into court again. And his whole career was nothing but harassment. And per his family and per his biography, there was 13 attempts on his life.
Wow.
And that's not different. So you brought up Eugene FM Blass. He actually had a product called Homazon, which is really sounds identical to chlorine dioxide. I think chemically it was, but it was attached to magnesium instead of chlorine. And the same stories. I mean, he was treating so many different diseases, and he also had a lot of trouble. He actually came to this country because he had invented some things for the coke mills, or like the smelting. I can't remember, one of those industries. And his technology was stolen from him. He had to go back to Germany. But then he came back and he was treating a lot of people with Omazon. And I'm going to tell you something really disturbing about his story is it's my very strongly held belief from some of the information that's come to me. He was scrubbed from the internet. I don't know
Wow.
if you'll get to that chapter in my book, but I write about him, and there's almost no mentions of him available through the internet. I got a couple of scrap, and by the way, I was doing that book in the era of AI, so I was using AI to try to find the record. And there's like this one newsletter called Oxidative News from like 20 years ago, and he has one kind of essay in there. I found a mention of him being on a ship from Portugal to back to Germany, repatriated after the war. He's on a ship register, but there's literally nothing there. And the person who told me about him, I would have never known about him. Um, One of my main sources for the book, and this is where it gets really wild, and I don't know if you got to that, but that was an applied scientist who worked very, very close with intelligence throughout his whole career. And
Wow.
he's the one who alerted me to Blast. And he just gave me like a little snippet. And I looked into Blast a little bit. I found a couple of things. And then I asked him, I said, I can't find anything else. He says, you're not going to find anything else. He was scrubbed.
Wow.
And you want to get into some really freaky stuff here, Sherry? One of the main things that I learned from him is that he was very valued, I think, by intelligence. They used him for defecting scientists back in the 80s and 90s, and he helped the head of the Russian bioweapons program. a guy named Vladimir Pasechnik, who actually worked with David Kelly. Remember the arms inspector, David Kelly, with the Iraq War? So Pasechnik defected, joined the bioweapons research center at in the UK at Portendown. Um, and he got friendly with Pasechnik, and Pasechnik told him back in the 80s that they had been doing research with chlorine dioxide. And he told him that the Russians, that Pasechnik said that it was the ultimate antidote to all bioweapons,
Wow.
which is not surprising because in all of the studies on chlorine dioxide, every in vitro study, it absolutely decimates any pathogen. And so the Russians knew this back in the 80s. And by the way, I'm writing this book. This is where we have to do our disclaimers, right? You know, I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm not suicidal, and all that good stuff. Because this is clearly classified stuff. But not only that, but he was also told that they had done studies in tuberculosis. And chlorine dioxide was doing a bang-up job against TB.
Wow, that's just amazing. I think that they were using it in against Ebola in Central
Yes.
Africa and
Yes.
malaria, and that was going to really bang into the vaccine
And
industry.
And
You know?
anthrax also. You remember the Senate letters after what is that? After 9/11, they cleaned up the Senate offices real quick. After Hurricane Katrina, there's a famous story of a restaurant that was completely covered and infested with mold, like should have been condemned. They came in with chlorine dioxide, cleaned the place up in one day, got rid of all
Wow.
the mold. You know.
Well, you know, Court, one of the things that you talk about early on in your book, The War on Chlorine Dioxide, is that you created something called the Corey scale. And I found it helpful and amusing, but really, really important. Tell people how you came up with that and how it shows demonstrably using your technique that chlorine dioxide has been absolutely the most blackballed.
Yeah.
People who are listening to this may remember this as MSM. MSM was really promoted strongly. I think I still have a bottle of that in the basement somewhere.
Or you talking about MMS
Or
or MS?
MMS, I mean. Yeah,
MMS, yeah, yeah.
MMS. Yeah, and I think I still have a bottle of that in the basement somewhere from back in when Joyce Riley was on the radio talking about all that, like in the late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, I think. But you came up with this scale. Tell people
Yeah.
briefly what the scale is all about and
All
how
right.
it's really accurate.
First, let me just be a little bit self-deprecating and tell your audience why I like to try to name something after me. It's been an exercise I've had my whole teaching career in the hospital. I used to try to entertain the residents and the fellows when we did these, 5-hour rounds in the ICU. I would try to come, if your audience knows what a medical eponym is, it's when a doctor discovers something and he gets a disease named after him or a physical exam sign or something, we have so many diseases named after doctors. So I was like, I would kid my residents. I was like, I want to get something named after me in medicine. And I would pick the dumbest things, right? Just to entertain them. And so in the ICU, I used to have something called, that I called the Corey sign. It was also actually a way to teach them. And the Corey sign, it was a sign that predicted with 100% accuracy a patient's readiness to come off of a ventilator. And you want to know what the sign was, Sherri? It was when they were totally wide awake. There was a tube in their mouth, and they were usually restrained so they wouldn't pull out the tube, and they were shaking the bed rest. So when you saw a patient wide awake with enough strength, and they're looking at you like mad at you, and they're shaking the bed rest, I was like, that person's ready. So it's an obvious sign. And then I had another Corey sign for when they were ready to leave the ICU, which was anytime I went into a patient's room in the ICU, and if their legs were crossed in bed, they were ready to go. Critically ill patients do not cross their legs in bed. So anyway, that's the background of it. But the Corey scale isn't as funny. The Corey scale really comes out of what I've been forced to see since COVID broke out, which is the more threatening a therapy is, right, to the pharmaceutical industry. And again, what are the things that make a medicine threatening? Is that it's inexpensive, right? Typically off patent, repurposed, widely available, and super safe, right? And that competes with anything that they can bring out. So the Achilles heel of the pharmaceutical industry or is repurposed drugs, or God forbid, repurposed anything like chlorine dioxide is, right? And so the Corey scale posits that the more attacks that they lodge at the actual treatment, either via propaganda, via legislation, going after doctors who advocate for it, the harder they go after that drug is directly correlated to how well that drug works, right? It's a pretty simple concept, right? Because let's say I came out with a therapy that said, avocados cure cancer, right? Like they wouldn't spend a lot of time with Dr. Corey's avocado therapy, right? Because it's kind of silly, it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't work. They would just let me go on blathering on about avocado. I present no threat to them. They don't even want to take the time. But when you come out with something real that actually works and you start bringing it out, and how do I know this, Sherri? I suddenly I became Dr. Ivermectin in COVID because I said it worked. I didn't realize my entire career was going to blow up over it for saying the truth. But in researching that book, particularly, it was the research of that book that really where it hardened into, because what I realized is what happened to me in COVID with ivermectin has been happening to doctors for 100 years, starting with one of the most brilliant doctors of the early 20th century, Dr. Koch. He had his career completely ruined. And because he came up with a threatening therapy that was going to hurt the existing business model. I mean, back then they were making tons of money off of radiation. That was the
So hold that
mainstay
thought right
place.
there, Corey. We got a
Yeah,
heartbreak coming up here for
sure.
our things. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about Dr. Koch, but we're going to have to take a hard break here right now to hear from our sponsors from AmericaOutloud.news. AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio plays the Tenpenny Files on the radio network at 3 p.m. Eastern, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And if you've missed any of these great conversations, you can find the Tenpenny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on my platforms at drtenpenny.com and drtenpenny.substack.com. Because there's so many great books and so many great documentaries with so little time to read and watch because we're all so terribly busy. This show is meant to maximize your time and jumpstart your learning and education into topics that you may have never heard about or topics you always wish you had more time to investigate into. Sit tight. We'll be right back. We're going to continue this conversation with Dr. Pierre Kory about the war on chlorine dioxide. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking with Dr. Pierre Kory about his new and very important book, The War on Chlorine Dioxide, the shocking history of a simple molecule that kills pathogens, neutralizes toxins, and restores health at the cellular level, yet has been relentlessly suppressed and censored for more than 100 years. But let me tell you just a little bit more about our guest, Dr. Pierre Kory. Dr. Kory is a pulmonary and critical care physician and former associate professor and chief of the critical care services at the University of Wisconsin. Before COVID-19, he was internationally recognized as a pioneer in critical care ultrasonography and as a senior editor of an award-winning textbook translated into 7 languages. During the pandemic, he co-founded the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Most of you commonly know that as FLCCC. He has also pioneered the use of ivermectin and COVID-19. Dr. Kory is the author on the War on Ivermectin and the upcoming book, From Volcanoes to Vitality, about a mineral science that we're going to have him back on when the book is all done and is published to discuss in great detail. Dr. Kory, right before the break, you were talking about Dr. Koch and the things that he was doing. Why don't you finish up your thought on that and how important his work was? And he too was wiped out and kind of disseminated by the healthcare industry.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of talking about the pattern, right? It's that, the pattern started, or it goes as far back as him. When I found this great, phenomenal physician and scientist who early 20th century had his career destroyed for coming up with a therapy that threatened existing business model of treating cancer, and what they did to him. I mean, it's shocking, and it just repeats itself. I don't know if you know. I'm sure you've heard of the Brzezinski case, right? With that one was phenomenal. That's like 70s and 80s, right? Where for 2 decades they went after him for his anti-neoplaston therapy, and so you see this pattern just echo. But Koch was really a truly remarkable example, not only for how old this story has gone on with the persecution of doctors who do what they're trained to do and what they're inspired to do, which is to help people and come up with therapies to treat them. And if it's all well if you do that, as long as it makes somebody money. But if it threatens the money that someone's making, they do not like you. And I find, it's a little weird, Sherri, but I had this like analogy. I saw this chart, like actually while I was writing the book, I saw a chart which showed what happened in the cell phone market, right? Remember BlackBerry had owned the entire industry, right? Everyone had a BlackBerry, right? And along comes the iPhone. And when you look at the charts of sales and market share, you see one just start to plummet and the other one takes over, right? And then there's the Android. And I remember seeing that and I was like, wow, that's what competition looks like in the marketplace. And then I started to think of that's not how it works in the medical marketplace. You can't come up with, an alternative to chemotherapy. I mean, could you imagine if you had something safe and tolerable and cheap? You get destroyed. They do not. Yeah, they don't play like that. You can't come up with a better way of doing something if it's going to damage the profits of what already exists. And so I find the medical kind of industry or pharmaceutical industry or biomedical industry really to be one of the most rapacious and criminal, to be honest. And especially, part of my research for that book, I came across websites where people have cataloged, it's over 100 doctors, just in the last 30 years who have died unexpectedly, in strange circumstances. And each one had a therapy that they were advocating for that threatened existing models. And so it's an industry where it's about suppression and threatening and harassment. I mean, look at COVID. I mean, you got harassed, I got harassed. I lost my board certifications just for speaking truths, and it's rough. It's rough. It's a very I don't think people realize that the pharmaceutical industry, this has been by whistleblowers, whistleblower executives who've written books. They really describe it. It is a mafia, and there is an omerta, right? Omerta is where you participate in criminal activity, but you do it without saying it, right? Everything's implied, right? And they know how they operate, and they saw those pharmaceutical companies behaving like mafia.
Well, Bobby Kennedy, before he became Secretary Kennedy, frequently talked about the pharmaceutical industry being convicted felons. I
Yeah.
mean, they got charged with all of these of killing people, and they just wrote it off as they just paid a fine. And that when they would come out with a new drug, they knew a certain number of people would die from it, so they would just set aside a certain amount of profits into a pot until which time they got called on the table, they got charged, they got found guilty, and like they already had the money set aside to pay the fine. That
Yeah.
they're a bunch of criminals. And look at what Pfizer did to the world with the mRNA vaccine, and then the suppression of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine all the way through COVID that could have saved millions of lives.
Yeah.
What do you think honest science would look like if we could actually do real science on these therapies and bring them forward the way that they should be brought forward?
I think there is a way, and I've heard smatterings of it. I saw a mention of it early on with Bobby, since Bobby came on. But my feeling on how corrupted science is, I think there's a lot of leverage points in which that corruption is being exercised or executed. But for me, the fulcrum are the medical journals. And we'd have to change two things. Number one, you'd have to literally have a medical journal that has a few qualities. Number one, it's divorced from any financial incentives. But here's the trick. You'd have to remove the financial incentives, but you'd also have to give it the stature it would require, right? Because in medical sciences, right, no one pays attention to the second, third, and fourth tier journals, right? They're rubbish journals. We don't pay attention to them. They literally, the world's eyes are on the big five, right? Which is New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, the BMJ, Lancet, and then Annals of Internal Medicine. And then obviously there's a few other prominent ones. But those are the ones that are completely under the control of the pharmaceutical industry, number one. Number two, those are the only ones where you can publish a paper and immediately get a massive global PR campaign. Because I watched that in COVID. I saw the tight linkage between studies being published and media attention. The media fan the flames of all of the most corrupt studies throughout COVID and all of the good things, the ones where you really found out the truth about the vaccine or how effective ivermectin were. They were retracting those left and right. They were rejecting those left and right. You couldn't publish real science in COVID. You could only publish, curated studies that met that the masters approved. Like how long are you going to be a journal editor if you published an honest study showing data on how toxic and lethal the COVID vaccines were? I mean, you're done. You're probably done for your job, and then I would argue you're probably done. So,
Yeah,
so
serious.
but here's the thing, Sherri. I think Bobby or Bhattacharya talked about that, about wanting to start like an NIH journal, one where, I do think government can be good. It hasn't been in many, many decades because I think it's been captured. But I think Bobby's a breath of fresh air. I think he wants to do the right thing. He wants to put science back. He wants to write science. It's collapsed and been captured and corrupted. But I do think there's a way to be transparent and independent, free ourselves from the financial incentives and allow for science to be published. The other thing that has to happen, now we're going to get geeky, is we have to destroy this whole evidence-based medicine propaganda. I mean, this whole thing of like the only scientific truths come out of massive randomized controlled trials. Like that's the only way we know when something works. I can tell something works. If it's really good, I can tell it within 2 patients. So like, why do I need like a randomized controlled trial of 5,000 in each arm? But yeah, the evidence-based medicine, then I think that's the other major thing, is that they rewrote the rules of how to practice medicine. They changed what are millennia and centuries of observational decision making. Like we learn through patterns, through seeing patients, trajectories of disease. We know that when we introduce a therapy and we know that disease, its expected trajectory. And when it doesn't follow that trajectory and suddenly they're improving, like we can tell at the bedside. When you have close contact with your patient, we know what works. We know it doesn't work. We know it's harmful. Obviously the tiny, very low frequency harms or the mild effects. Sure, for those you need big trials, but there's so much that we can know without needing randomized controlled trials. Yet, anytime, I find something that works, you want to try to talk to someone in a hospital about something that works and you don't have a randomized controlled trial to put in their hands. It's anecdotal. It's anecdotal. Everything's anecdotal.
Yeah, it's like doctors have been taught to no longer believe what's in front of their eyes.
Yep.
And it's not only about the medical journals that have been captured, because didn't they change this a while back that they were no longer allowed to publish if a researcher did a trial on, say, on a drug, and they found out that it had no efficacy or negative efficacy, that it hurt people instead of helped them, they're not allowed to publish that. Or at least they were trying to get that passed so that they couldn't publish negative results. Only if it was something positive could they do it.
Well, yes.
I don't read enough of the
No, that's more of a bias than a rule, but yeah, you're absolutely right on that. Like,
Okay.
nobody gets excited about a negative trial. So like the journal editors, they're looking for positive trials, and that's all they publish. And negative trials are as important, right? Because you need
Oh,
to
they're
balance that.
equally as
Because if
important.
they're only
They're
publishing
actually
positive trials, yeah.
they're actually probably more important,
Yep.
because real science is if you've got 30 people that you trialed a drug on and it worked in 28 but didn't work in 2, the real science is trying to figure out what was it about the 2 it didn't work in, rather than just taking the bell curve of, oh, it worked over here, it worked 38 out of 40 times, so therefore it's safe and effective. Why didn't it work in those other 2? And nobody ever investigates that. And not only are research bench researchers and journal publications guilty about that, but the media is complicit in the ridicule
Yes.
too. Talk a little bit about that arm.
Yeah, I mean the media, I mean, it's funny. I always tell this kind of. I always put it in the context, Sherry. I mean, I call you. I know. I don't know if you do or don't like being called the OG, but I think of you as one of the original, whistleblowers calling the nonsense and seeing the corruption. I was buried in an ICU most of my career, and to be honest, there's not as much corruption in critical care as there is, in the little pills in the outpatient offices and all that. There has been frauds in the history. Like, remember Zygris? Remember that drug? It was a drug that was $5,000. Eli Lilly. That was a complete fraud. What was interesting is I went into the specialty in training during that fraud, and I was trained by my mentor who never once gave it. And you
Wow.
try to find an intensivist from the early 2000s who never gave Zygris, it'd be impossible to find someone. So I was actually trained by someone who like already was telling me, watch out for this, because they pull these things. But the media, what I learned, but going into COVID, I got to tell you, I say this all the time. I read the New York Times, have been reading it since I was like 7 years old, read it every day. I thought it was the arbiter of truth. I thought if you really wanted to go on, you read that. I believed in the big journals. I thought that only the best scientists and the best science was published there. I really believed in all the institutions of society. It gets even worse, Sherry. I literally thought Fauci was a sympathetic guy in a tough spot with a lot of critics.
Well, you've come a long way, Pierre.
You could say that again. Boy, have I come a long way. Because, I started from there, but then nothing was making sense. I saw policies coming out with no rationale, no scientific basis. In fact, it was overturning what I knew about disease and science, and they were doing it every day. And so I really started to see the world different. And then when I became the centerpiece of this war on ivermectin, and when I saw what the media was doing, and I just saw it, I started to learn what propaganda looks like, and it's so simple. I mean, everything is templated, right? So every article about ivermectin borrowed the same 3 phrases, used the same tactics, which is they got somebody with 3, 5, 7 letters after their name from some august institution who would say there's insufficient evidence for this, and then they would refer to me as an ivermectin advocate. I'm sorry, I was a professor and the chief of critical care. Like they would completely ignore your credentials while highlighting the other side's credentials. And so the media is, and the most important thing to know about the media, right, is that their largest advertiser is the pharmaceutical industry, right? So if they put out a program that's critical towards one of their products, I mean, do you want to end your TV station and your television producing career right now? I mean, that's a pretty quick way to do it. And so they literally control the media. And the fascinating part about that is that I finally figured out why they advertise all those drugs on television. because I was like, why are you advertising your drug when you can't get that drug unless it's prescribed? And one of the explanations is, oh, that way patients will ask their doctor for it. I never thought that was true. Like, oh, I saw this commercial about something for my arthritis. Can you prescribe that to me? No, the reason why they're putting those commercials on there is because they're pumping money into the advertising. The more ad spots they buy, the more they control those stations. And so it's a complete kind of smokescreen.
Yeah, it's also because if they pump the money in there, they're not allowed to do any negative stories about, say, Pfizer,
Yep.
Moderna, any of the vaccines, any of the drugs, because that's biting the hand that feeds you. So they put all of this money in there, and then they there's probably an unspoken, or maybe it's spoken, I don't know, but an unspoken threat that says, we're paying your bills. Don't say anything bad about us.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is, right? And why did I just come up with this? I figured I'm pretty sure you've heard it, but you know what HPV stands for, the vaccine?
Yeah,
Have
human
you ever?
papillomavirus.
Yeah, no, but um, no, the more pejorative one. It's I think I can't remember the first term, but it's had to pay for Vioxx, HPV.
Oh,
Because after the
well, yeah,
Vioxx scandal, after that
yeah,
massive, they paid 5 billion for Vioxx, then they come out with this blockbuster HPV vaccine, and so it's have to pay for Vioxx. That's how cynical, that's how dark all this gets. You know,
yeah, for
you know.
sure. Well, you know what, Dr. Pierre Kory, in the end, you wrote this book, The War on Chlorine Dioxide, despite all these risks that we've talked about, risk of a reputation and employment, risk of death, of all these people that have been killed by, like Semmelweis, by just coming up
Yep.
with this idea to wash your hands, and
Yep.
all the things that have happened to other researchers along the way, that have been really terrible. They've like with Dr. Royal Rife, all the things that
Yes.
happened to him. But at the end of the day, despite all the professional criticism, you decided to write this book anyways. Why?
You know, because I loved teaching medicine. That's what I did. I'm just gonna, at the risk of sounding grandiose, I mean, I was pretty good at it. I won teaching awards at every institution I was at. I mean, everybody loved coming into the ICU and rounding with me, and I just love to teach. And when I learn something that I think is important for someone to know, I just love putting it out there. And the thing about chlorine dioxide is it's interesting, Sherri. I first heard of it 3 years ago, and I tried to look into it, and like nothing made sense. I couldn't find any published literature on it. Yet I was reading these books where people were saying it cured literally everything in the world, and there was such this disconnect. And I actually just dismissed it. I was like, well, I don't know what this nonsense chlorine dioxide is. And what happened was about a year ago today, it was in December last year. Um, we heard of about a nasal spray that was good for sinusitis, and it's on the market. It's chlorine dioxide, and my partner met the woman who owns the company, and I guess she'd invited my partner to join like a Zoom. She had like a little Zoom group, and that day I sent her a question, and she said, "Hey, do you want to join a Zoom?" And I said, I was a Saturday afternoon. I was like, okay, whatever. So I joined the Zoom, and there's about six people in there. These are serious, serious doctors. And one of them was an MD, PhD from Brazil who had I gotten to know during COVID because he worked for, he was also part of a nonprofit down there that invited me to speak, and I got to spend some days with him. And I mean, I had the most respect for it. I mean, he's high level researcher, phenomenal clinician, employs a huge breadth of therapies. And when I saw him on that Zoom, and it was literally a chlorine dioxide group, I just started to listen because I could tell these people were serious. It wasn't just like a couple of books and people saying that they're treating malaria in the jungles of somewhere like. And then I got to hear that all of these people deeply researched, very highly credentialed, and they'd all been using chlorine dioxide. Now they're all in South America. None of them are in the U.S. But that's when I kind of really opened my eyes and I started to, and I really just listened that whole Zoom. And I couldn't believe that this thing was real. And then I started to look into it, and a couple of them started pointing me the way. They were giving me some of the documents, some of the things, and I don't know how much time we have left, but the thing that really completely got me into chlorine dioxide is learning about what happened in Bolivia. in COVID. And briefly, what happened is the clinicians who knew chlorine dioxide were petitioning the legislators to let them pass a law, let us use chlorine dioxide in COVID. And a bunch of legislators passed a law allowing for the manufacture and distribution of chlorine dioxide. The military, the Bolivian military manufacturing, the universities were manufacturing. They were giving it out in the street. There were lines like 500, 800 people long. And after that law passed, the cases and death plummeted in Bolivia. And what's interesting is they sent me a lot of clips of Bolivian television at the time, and it was the first time you could see like the both sides argument. And they would be interviewing a clinician on a news program, but then they would bring in like the regulator, like the FDA or the head of the Pharmacy Association, and just listening to those two, it was like a comedy. Because the doctor was just saying how they were kicking butt, everyone was getting better. Their mayors were coming on saying we're emptying ICUs, and yet the regulators are saying there's no evidence for this and it's toxic and we don't agree with this law. And they were just like getting really angry at the law. And so when I saw that happen in Bolivia, I said, "Oh, this thing is real. This is the Kory scale right here."
Well, Dr. Kory, I am so glad that you wrote this book. I mean, when I first found out about that this was coming out, I was like, good, somebody needs to get this out because there's so much discrepancies. Like people that are like say it cures everything, to other people that say it's toxic, to other people like myself that would just say I just don't know that much about it. But now, thankfully,
like me.
book, I'm going to learn a lot about it. Where can people find your book, and where can they follow your?
Yeah. So the book can be purchased at just War on Chlorine Dioxide. So it's not The War, it's waronchlorinedioxide.com. And then my Substack is probably the best place to follow me, and that's Pierre Kory Medical Musings.com. Pierre Kory Medical Musings. And then my clinic, we have a clinic that operates, we do telehealth in all 50 states, and that's Leading Edge Clinic, or the URL is drpierrekory.com.
Very good. Well, Pierre, I'm so grateful to have you on and talk about this right out of the box. It's going to get widely distributed, and I hope that everybody will pick up a copy and read it because it's really well written. And you and Jenna did a great job of your co-writer putting it together because it's not just a bunch of dry facts. I mean, it's entertaining. It's very readable. It sucks you right in, and with the storyline, it's really very, very good. So thank you for being on the show with us today. And thank you so much for writing it. And I'm looking forward to having you back on when your next book comes out about the minerals, because you and I've spoken at a couple of conferences about that. And I can't wait to hear about it once you get it all done. So with that,
I can't wait to come back.
I want to thank everybody for being here with us today. Thank you for being a Tenpenny Prime member. Thank you for following us on AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio. We will see you here tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, or the next time. Or you can come and find us at drtenpenny.com, where you can also find my book, Zero Accountability in a Failed System, everything that you wanted to know about vaccines and were afraid to ask. And you can also follow me on X and on Instagram at Busy Dr. T. So I want to say thank you to everyone. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you again tomorrow or the next time on the Tenpenny Files. Goodbye and God bless.